At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs.
Hello everyone, it's me, Hannah, and Professor Jo Neal today. We're both so excited for our guest. It's a topic we've wanted to cover for a long time, and we couldn't have a more perfect guest. So today we're going to be talking all about poppers with Adam Zmith. So Adam Zmith is a writer, producer, working right across books, podcasts, short film and theatre. So I came across Adam when I was recommended his book, Deep Sniff, A History of Poppers and Queer Futures by my friend Jo, when I was preparing for a festival talk, and I really didn't know the treat I was going to be in for. So the book takes you on a journey from the discovery of poppers through to their use on queer dance floors and in bedrooms, as well as into their discussion in many political debates. It's full of wit, explores queer history and experience, and is an unapologetic celebration of pleasure. So a very warm welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. That was a lovely introduction to the book and me. Thanks, Hannah.
I really, really enjoyed it. It was a great recommendation, and I've been recommending it to more and more people. So hopefully the podcast is only going to get the book more out there. So it's always nice for our listeners to know a little bit about our guests. So before we get into the story of poppers and how you came to write the book, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey to becoming a writer and a producer?
Yeah, I think I started writing when I was really little. I used to write like a family newspaper that I pushed under the bedroom door of my mum and dad and my sister. And then I was also writing like short stories. I thought I could write a Goosebumps book about the monster that lived in the river behind our house. So I tried to write a Goosebumps book in an old school exercise book. I think writing is the one thing that I've done longest and most consistently in my life. And newspapers, children's horror books, and then all the way through to like you said, a book about poppers and history. Therefore, I'm a promiscuous writer, I say, because I've written about lots of different things in my life. Now my work focuses on the intersections between LGBTQ plus stuff, sex and history. So all of my work has a combination of those three factors in it in different measures. I'm also promiscuous writer in terms of the form. So I've written a few books, I've written some pieces for theatre, and I make podcasts, and sometimes those need to be written as well. So that's what I do. And how have I done it? I don't know. I did get a job as an editorial assistant. It was my first like full-time job in an editorial kind of writing capacity. That was for a legal publishing company. And then I became a reporter on a magazine about intellectual property in that same company. And then I went back to university and did a master's degree in journalism. And then I found that I really liked writing about science, specifically the politics of science. So then I got a job as a science policy journalist, which, like one of like three people or whatever. And then I went to work at The Economist as a social media editor because I wanted to still be in an editorial capacity, but like a bit broader than intellectual property or science policy. So I was then working at The Economist for a few years, and then I earned good money there for the first time. So I saved up so that I could like leave that job and set myself up independently and do the right and make the things that I want to do, which is what I do now for a lot less money, but I'm free. That's the potted history.
Lovely. Are you working on a book at the moment?
Yes, always, Jo. Obviously, there's a novel like kind of like rolling around in the background, but there always is. I've written 5 unpublishable novels before. Yes, I am preparing to publish a book in January with a co-author, Tash Walker. We made a podcast series called The Logbooks together, and it was an LGBTQ plus history of Britain through the handwritten notes and stories from volunteers at Switchboard, the helpline that has been helping people with LGBTQ plus issues for 5 decades now. So we made a podcast series and then we've written a book about it now. And it's very much about our experience as children of the 80s, this kind of like middle generation in this huge queer politics shift that's happened, reconnecting with our elders, discovering queer stories that were kept from us, specifically by government and others. And so that's coming out in January from Faber. So that's very exciting.
Very.
And it's written now, and we're just working out the marketing and the publicity and which bookshops we can go and do talks at and stuff.
Oh, exciting. Yeah. I mean, it's great that you're a promiscuous writer, because otherwise you wouldn't have the book Deep Sniff,
Yes.
which just covers science, memoir, history.
Yeah. There's a chapter about me wanking in it,
Yeah.
which don't hold back. You know.
It brings it all together. It really is a journey. The book does take you through so many different aspects. So some of our listeners might not actually know what poppers are. And so poppers can also be called alkyl nitrates. So could you just tell us first what they are, how do you take them, and just in general, how do they make people feel?
Yeah. Poppers is really a kind of like a common name for a collection of substances which you named there. And there was the very first one was amyl nitrite, which we might go into. That was the very first substance that was isolated as having the effect of, when you sniff the vapor, it relaxes your muscles, it dilates your blood vessels, which means there's more oxygen getting to your brain. So it gives you this temporary high, and it's a specific kind of high connected to the feeling relaxed in your muscles, being disinhibited, but also, and you know, for some people it specifically relaxes muscles that are useful in sex, especially if you're having sex in the bum. And it also kind of has this capacity to, like, in that state, make you feel like very connected to another person if you're with another person or more, and also in a kind of sexy way, and even like sexy with yourself. So that's what poppers do. It's a liquid that you usually now buy in a small bottle, and it's not the liquid that you want, it's the vapor that is rising from that liquid, and you hold the bottle up to your nose and you take a sniff of that vapor.
So it has effects in the brain then, as well as the body, all over the body?
Yeah, because it's your brain gets a lot more oxygen because the blood is flowing. It reduces your blood pressure by dilating your blood vessels, so your brain is getting more oxygen. This is what I'm told, and that is a thing that helps to produce the effect, as well as your muscles getting a lot more blood because the lowering of blood pressure, which therefore relaxes the muscles because they like having lots of blood and they can relax and they can chill out and let things happen.
And so then how did you end up coming to write the book? What made you decide that you wanted to write a book all about poppers?
Simply, no one else had done it. Yeah. And I had questions. And every time I spoke to other people in the life who used poppers and knew about, and like had poppers, you know, whether it was like my friends or lovers or whoever, like everyone just sort of saw them as like a funny thing. Like it was almost like poppers was almost like a punchline, as well as being like a sexy, hot thing that you do in sex as well. But like it was kind of like a joke, but no one really knew very much about it when I was asking people. And so I like Googled a couple of times to find out more, and I found basically the same 3 or 4 facts about the history of poppers online, about that they were that they were first used for medical reasons by the Victorians, and that they were present in the 1970s debauchery of discos in New York and London. So there was like a couple of these facts, and these facts just got repeated in more and more online articles, and it was the same facts coming up again, including the name of the doctor from the Victorian era who kind of popularized the use of amyl nitrite medically. And I just felt unsatisfied with these same 3 or 4 facts coming up again and again as the history of poppers. So I just thought someone's got to find out more about this, and that was me.
And how did you find out more? What was your research method?
So I wrote the full first draft of the book in 2020 in the autumn, which meant that we were still in a certain kind of lockdown and in and out a little bit, but very much everything was still restricted. So that's one factor. Another factor is that I'm not affiliated to a university or another kind of institution. So, you know, I'm an independent person, and I'm always asking for access to places or and people, and trying to convince them that they should speak to me or that they should help me with research, which is hard when you're just kind of yourself, you know? So those two factors influence my answer to the question, which is I did a lot of online. I did everything online. I bought, every time I heard about a book that mentioned poppers, I could buy it and get it posted to me. And I just looked at a lot of any kind of archival reference that I could, where there was an online version, or I could contact the archive or the archivist and say, I can't come there because I'm not allowed or because it's lockdown. Can you send me stuff? Can you send me pictures, whatever? And then I think one of the ones that I did that I could really do was go to the Wellcome Collection, Wellcome Library. It's an open archive in London. Great. It's got a huge collection of medical history, and they had the notes of Thomas Lauder Brunton, who was the doctor in the Victorian time who popularized the use of poppers and was the first person to use amyl nitrite on a patient who was suffering with angina. So I could go to the Wellcome Library and I could actually sit there and physically and look at his published papers. And so that was one of the things of doing the research. The other part of doing the research was actually quite a lot of thinking and listening to music whilst thinking, partly because of the lockdown and other, I guess, restrictions, and maybe just also my own proclivities. I was just I used the project to go more and more into like what I thought and felt about queer identity and about queer history. And so that is how I wrote myself into the book a little bit more. And that required me to, some of the research in quotes was like me thinking about and interrogating my own thoughts and feelings and experiences in history as well. So some of the research was me sitting in an armchair listening to, intense dark synth music.
I think that's a brilliant combination, of all the research and the history and your own personal kind of feelings about it. I think that's absolutely lovely. It's probably pretty unusual.
Yeah, I think it can be unusual to do it like that, but it's just how I like to work, I don't like to be constrained by usual genres or something, which is easier said than done.
Can you tell us a bit more about the initial discovery?
Yeah, there was a French chemist in 1844, Jérôme Antoine Ballard. People are going to write in about my bad French. Who was it? Just the kind of blue skies, basic chemist, researcher. I mean, basic science. Just, fiddling around with different substances, making combinations. And he isolated this thing, which was named amyl nitrite, which he just noticed that it made him blush when he breathed the fumes. But he didn't think that there was much else, there was much use of it. But it was in the literature by that point as a substance that was made, and how it could be produced, and that it made this person blush. And then I think, so that was 1844. And it took a good couple of decades, really, for a clinician, a doctor, Thomas Lauder Brunton, that I mentioned earlier, who was treating angina patients. It took a couple of decades before he picked up on it as something that had been talked about in kind of basic research as something that had that effect. And a few other scientists had done some other experiments on themselves and on rabbits to see that it was a vasodilator. So they knew that it was increasing the blood flow and stuff. But it still took until the 1860s or 70s for Thomas Lauder Brunton to notice what was going wrong in his angina patients was that their heart wasn't getting enough blood because their arteries were being constricted. So he got hold of some of this substance, and because he knew that it was a vasodilator, it helped to release the blood flow more easily. So he got hold of that and tried it in an angina patient, and lo and behold, it worked. When the pain came on, because their heart and their blood vessels are constrained, this relaxed all of that and it made the pain go away immediately. It didn't solve angina as a problem, it didn't cure it, but it could solve that immediate symptom. So then he went about writing papers about it and popularizing it to say, hey doctors, you can use this when your angina patient is really suffering with pain, and it can really work. And that's what it was used for, and then manufactured by pharmaceutical companies for the next few decades, well into the 20th century.
To treat angina?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, it's a cool history, isn't it? So I read that the first recreational use was 1964.
No, I mean, I think it would have been before then, but it's just hard to know for sure.
Seems late.
It does seem like because it had already been being used for 100 years by that point. So I think this is something I'm often asked, like, if you had more time and money for research and more resources, like, what would you do? And I would try to find out it to see if there's any records or anything like that of people using it recreationally as early as possible. There are rumors that it would be like horny medical students that would have had access to it in the 1930s. And the 1930s were like, before the 1920s and 1930s, before fascism, before the rise of conservative Catholics becoming very powerful in the US, before fascism in Europe on the rise, and the rise of cultural fascism and conservatism in Britain. You've got people not just being horny, but actually being able to like go through with it. So you can imagine medical students having access to it, and that's what I'd heard as well, that in the 1920s or 30s the medical students were using it, and when they were having sex. But it's really definitely by the 50s it is happening in a very small way. People are aware of it and they're going to pharmacies and getting it. So and especially men who have sex with men, they're young men, sexually active young men, going to pharmacies and saying, I've got angina, can I buy some amyl nitrite? So by the mid-60s, pharmacies were like, hang on a minute, what's going on? Why are all these otherwise young, healthy men? Because being young is not a risk factor for angina. It tends to be older people and older men that have angina. So they cottoned on in the sort of mid to late 60s.
And so originally you could get it without a prescription, and then you had to get a prescription for it.
Yeah, the prescription, it's a classic thing about drugs, isn't it? The prescription requirement came down because people were using it recreationally for quote unquote improper use. So then a regulation came in, and obviously I know that this is a sort of central thing to explore in your podcast, is the relationship between regulation, law, drugs and use. And so poppers follow that classic trajectory of like people getting hold of a thing, enjoying it, and then the law saying that's not an allowed use of that thing.
Pleasure always being prohibited.
Yeah.
Which is what we've always seen. Yeah. And people will always find a way. And I mean, people were finding a way. Mm-hmm. So how did it then cross over then into queer culture and clubbing? Yeah. How did it become more widely available for people to access?
Yeah, well, I mean, something that I thought a lot about and wrote about in the book, and actually I think it's chapter 3. I think it's a chapter that like a lot of people really talk about and ask me about a lot, which I didn't really predict, is the actual commercialization of it as a product. Because after the prescription requirement came in, and it came in roughly in the same time in the UK and the US in the late 60s, people were still getting hold of it. But soon the some American companies set up and said, well, we can actually just manufacture this ourselves, and there's no law about selling it for what we want to sell it for, recreational use, and we can just make it and sell it independently of the pharmacies. So it was some enterprising entrepreneurs in the US who knew that this was a part of gay, and they were men, and they knew that this was a part of gay culture by this point, part of the culture of men having sex with each other. And so they set about creating like a product version of it, really, with names like Rush and Locker Room, TNT. These were some of the really early names that they gave it to brand it. And also what I wrote about in the book, and this is what people often talk about, is that was happening in the USA, the commercialization, the creation of it as a commercial product with brand names like TNT, Locker Room and Rush, and slogans to do with power and potency and things like that. That was all happening at the same time that the gay male culture was really becoming more and more commercial itself in places like San Francisco and New York, in terms of there being like a distinct marketable demographic of gay men who called themselves gay and were living openly and proudly, and also spending money on going out, spending money on sex clubs, spending money on like alcohol, spending money on everything, setting up gay barbers and, gay nightclubs and all that stuff. And at the same time as that was this like ideal of like what a gay man should be, which includes those things of like potency and strength and power, these like traditional masculine attributes, which I find really interesting, because at the same time politically there was like people saying like, well, being gay kind of gets you off the hook from traditional attributes of masculinity. And yet this particular product, and a lot of products at that time, really kind of drew on those instincts that people had to want to be extremely masculine, even though, brackets, or quotes, even though they were gay. So I think that those two things going hand in hand in the same time in the 1970s in San Francisco and New York, and to some extent London, is just something that was really interesting to me.
Yeah, no, it really stood out to me as well, because I've always, when you see the packaging, it's kind of, you still kind of have that now. Yeah. Has it changed? Is there kind of any brands now that are trying to like tap into other audiences?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's one called Lady Poppers, which is like hilarious, and it's got like the little female symbol. Anyway, I think, yeah, there's been a lot more diversification of the branding in the past, definitely within the past 20 years, and quite extremely in the past five to 10 years. So there's still a lot of branding about like hardcoreness. So yeah, like things to do, like where brand names are basically derived from things like strength or extremity. There's a lot of brands that have got like XXX or XXL. They've got names like Amsterdam and Berlin, which have associations with like hardcore sex culture. Brands that have association to do with fisting and other like hardcore sex acts. So there's a lot of that kind of stuff. But there's also a lot of like silly ones, which I find really fun and interesting. Like ones called Oink or juicy things, like other things that are kind of fun and silly. And then recently, in recent years, there was a US brand that was taking a kind of completely different approach to its branding, and it was called Double Scorpio. So it was drawing on this astrology thing that a lot of queer people are really interested in, astrology, especially gay men. And also in the branding, it's quite disco effect, and they also had different flavors like pumpkin spice latte. I don't know if it smells like that. And their flavors were things like amber and emerald and stuff. And so they were kind of taking a like slightly more funky, different approach. But in the USA, the FDA has just shut down that company. So there's a few poppers companies in the USA that are quite worried at the moment, because that company, Double Scorpio, has been raided and shut down by the USA. Oh. So that's a thing that's happening. But it was an interesting way that they were branding.
I haven't heard about them being shut down. So is that fairly recent? And do you know why?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of I don't know why is the answer. There's speculation, because there's speculation about. So there's been a few cases in hospitals where people have drunk poppers, which you shouldn't do, drinking the liquid and then either dying or being very seriously injured. So that draws attention to poppers. And then in the US, the regulator, the FDA, kind of gets twitchy and says, well, this is a dangerous substance that people are just buying and then like using it incorrectly. This is a kind of like sort of charitable, non-political interpretation of what's going on. There's a more political interpretation, which is that Robert F. Kennedy, who's the health secretary, is very anti-drugs and anti things like poppers, because his mission is to make America healthy again, in quotes. But he's also like, that means he's also anti-vaccine. It's a certain kind of health policy. And he also has linked poppers with HIV/AIDS, which is not a true link.
No.
And so it's a part of like a sort of the current US administration's approach to health, which is quite chaotic and quite strange and not science-based. And so some people think it's to do with that.
Psych Symposium returns to London this winter on Thursday, 4th of December. It is Europe's most focused event for psychedelic medicine, drug development, and mental health innovation. Hosted in partnership with Prohibition Partners, this one-day summit at Conway Hall brings together the leaders shaping this field. Investors, regulators, biotech founders, researchers, and clinicians will all be in the room. We will explore clinical trial design, neuropsychiatric innovation, formulation strategies, and access frameworks for psychedelic therapies. With over 400 senior stakeholders attending, this is the best place in Europe to build the partnerships that will matter most in 2026. Tickets are now available at psychsymposium.com. You can register for the event and find out more in the show notes. Speaker submissions are also open for those with fresh data, policy insights, or clinical experience to share. If you are looking to build visibility with decision makers, tailored sponsored opportunities are also available. Visit psychsymposium.com and join us this December in London.
Yeah, even though their president was advocating bleach in the pandemic.
For COVID, yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Complete madness. So it's really, really interesting. So is there much sort of education and harm reduction around the use of poppers?
I don't
don't drink them, these are the best products.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a really weird answer, I think, to that, Joe. So I think you could definitely say the answer is no. I think there are obviously like harm reduction charities, like in the UK we have Talk to Frank, campaigns like that obviously always have an entry for poppers. I think it's generally not seen as, I mean, it's not a harmful thing unless you drink it, but as a substance, the harm rates are very, very small and obviously tiny compared to something like alcohol, which is completely available and like does much more harm to the individual and socially. But when you compare alcohol with lots of other drugs that are like much more illegal, it's alcohol, it always comes out different anyway. So I think there's like kind of, it's included in public campaigns like that, but it's just not, because it's like a product that you can buy in the USA and the UK, like it's not illegal, and B, because the harms are so small, I don't think it gets much attention. And then on the side of the manufacturers and the sellers, they're not incentivized to want to do anything at all because they're trying to skirt around the law in the way that they sell it. So they don't want to draw attention to themselves. They don't want to like be involved in conversations with government unless government was coming to them and saying, we're going to regulate you unless you talk to us and do something. So I think what they do is they just print legal things on the bottles often, which says like not for human consumption, as in don't drink it. So they do that. But then they also deliberately market them as room odorizer and boot cleaner. And they're neither of those. They are neither of those. But it's one of those things where like, if you know, you know. So if you know what it is, and you know it's not for cleaning your boots or for odorizing your room, but it's funny that manufacturers and sellers like literally sell it with that on it, knowing that that's not what it's for. So they're kind of, it's a sleight of hand, really. They're not really incentivized to like talk openly about what it is and how you use it.
So yeah, I guess instead you kind of need to rely a bit more on like peer support, like peer harm reduction, which you have already within queer communities.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's the thing. Like there was a video that went viral last week or the week before by a straight guy who was from Britain, who was on holiday in Paris with his girlfriend, and he bought a bottle. He went to a kiosk to get like one of those tiny little bottles of caffeine shots, and he bought a bottle of poppers by mistake and downed it. And that's partly because of the marketing of them, is that they do look quite similar sometimes, and it says things like energy or power on it sometimes. And he didn't smell it before he downed it, which would have been a first mistake. It would have been the first thing to do. Anyway, so, and a lot of the comments on that was that, like, this is why having gay friends can save your life. Because he had to go to, he was poisoned, it's a serious, it will poison you. So he was collapsing, he went to hospital, they had to give him an antidote immediately, and he survived. It's very easy to die doing it like that. But a lot of the comments on that viral video were like, if he was gay or if he knew gay people, he would have known what poppers is, and he would have known that the one thing that you do not do is drink it. And I think that there's a truth in that like you learn about poppers from other people in the know, and that's the thing that like as queer men and queer people more broadly we always do to survive, whether it's anything to do with substances or anything else. We talk to each other, we learn from each other, and we hear from our own elders from the queer community, because that's where we get the best information.
So I found out through your book about was it the Gay Switchboard?
Yeah,
I had no idea of this. Would you maybe just tell us a little bit about the Gay Switchboard?
Yeah, Switchboard is a charity now that was founded in 1974, so it's been going for more than 50 years, and it was started by a group of gay radicals who had kind of burnt out of the gay liberation movement in the early 1970s, which was, very activist campaigning, protesting, trying to change laws, trying to make a huge fuss in society in favor of gay liberation. But there's only so long you can do that before you burn out in the face of, heterosexist patriarchy. And so a couple of them kind of said what the community really needs is a way for people to call and ask and answer questions about everything from like, where is there a gay bar in Bristol, to how do I tell my mum I'm a lesbian, to I think I'm not the gender that they told me I was, all of that stuff. So they set up a phone line in a room in the basement of a bookshop, actually in the room above a bookshop, and then it moved to the basement. And that became the charity that's now called Switchboard, the LGBTQ plus helpline. And it's still going today, answering calls and answering instant messages and emails and stuff. So it supports people with questions about sexuality and gender identity. And for sure, you can ring them if you want advice on poppers, because it's something that they know a lot about.
Yeah, no, that's a great resource. And were they involved as well? Again, this completely came as a surprise to me, was learning all about the raids of the pubs in London and their involvement in kind of coordinating like responses to the raids.
Yeah, well, so Switchboard for many years, certainly by the late 70s and all the way through the 80s and through the 90s, was, you know, prior to the internet and prior to us all having a phone that we walk around with, Switchboard as a landline, and as in the 80s something that was operating 24/7, was the real nexus, the connector of the LGBTQ plus community, the lesbian and gay community. And so what that meant was, when, I don't remember the year, in the late 80s, when the Royal Vauxhall Tavern and other pubs were raided by cops, by police that were basically intimidating a lot of gay venues in general, but they were also responding to the growing hysteria about HIV/AIDS and the ignorance and the confusion about how that was transmitted, as how the HIV virus was transmitted. The police raided some bars to intimidate them, and one of the things that they fingered, so to speak, was poppers. And so they basically raided bars and kind of seized, and they seized poppers. They investigated whether to charge landlords and landladies with selling a poison and stuff like that. And the RVT was one of those. So when those things happened, people phoned Switchboard to say, this is happening right now. So if anyone's calling Switchboard to say, where shall I go out tonight? Don't tell them not to go to this bar because it's being raided by police. And also it was good for Switchboard to know that this was happening, so that they could track it. If someone rang to ask about poppers, they could say, oh, well, just beware at the minute, there's a crackdown by police, you know, that kind of thing. So yeah, Switchboard was a central part of like LGBT life, especially in London, even though it's a national service. And there were lots of local switchboards as well, which have all now kind of folded into the main national one.
And so how did the raids kind of come to a close? Did the police just decide eventually to stop raiding?
Yeah, it seems so. I mean, they did 2 raids on the RVT that were around at that time, one of which was specifically about poppers, that I know about anyway, that's in the record. They might have done more. But there was, you know, quite a bit of negative publicity about it. And I think that the police, as they always have been and as they still are always dancing around this thing of like, how much do we use our might to enforce the law? How are we interpreting what's the general political temperature at the moment, and how can we convert that into actions that the police can legally do? And that's very much happening right now in terms of protest. It's like, how are the police interpreting what's the political weather, and how do they manifest that in their police enforcement actions, right? So I think they were doing that around poppers and around gay culture, because remember in the 80s and 90s, and before, there were sexual offences on the books which were specifically enforced against men who had sex with men, including soliciting and importuning, which was, you know, you could just be chatting someone up in a bar. You could just be a man chatting up another man in a bar, and that's like importuning or soliciting for sex, which was illegal if it was a man doing it with a man. So they were interpreting the political weather, I think, which was in the 80s and into the 90s hostile towards men having sex with men and other kinds of queer people. And then I think I don't think it was a coordinated action or anything. I think it was just that things moved on, and they found other groups to harass. They found, you know, young black men to harass and other groups of people.
Yeah, you'd hope it was kind of through education and better understanding, and, you know, but...
Well, I think the police have, I don't know specifically about poppers, but in terms of their relationship with the LGBTQ plus community, the police has gained more education, and as the forces have been more around that. But then on the other hand, there's been reports in recent years finding them institutionally homophobic and transphobic. Actually, no, it stopped short of saying transphobic, but there are instances of transphobia. But I think it could be said to be institutionally. So, yeah.
Are you concerned then by the situation in the States with poppers being tried to link back to AIDS again?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a kind of classic conspiracy theory meme that boomerangs around time and time again. It started during the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis in the mid-80s, when a lot of people were trying to like point the finger. You know, understandably, people were like, what is this new virus? It's horrible. People are dying. This is really bad. And so you can see why people are like looking for something to blame. And there's a correlation, because a lot of men that were dying of it were men that had lots of sex and they used poppers, sex with each other. So there was a correlation. So anyway, it comes back in time and time again. But for sure, scientifically, now that we know about how HIV works and how AIDS related symptoms develop, like it's not connected. But I guess I am worried about poppers being implicated in the ongoing HIV/AIDS epidemic globally. I think it's only really a problem. I mean, HIV/AIDS is like a global problem, and the vast majority of people that live with HIV and AIDS now are not in rich Western countries like the USA and the UK. To the extent that poppers is implicated in that issue, it's only affecting those rich like West countries, and for the most part like gay men or men having sex with men, as opposed to like, there's a much bigger global crisis around HIV/AIDS, where there's no big overlap between poppers use and the people that are affected. So I think you've got to keep things in perspective like that. But that said, poppers has brought a lot of people a lot of pleasure and continues to do so. And pleasure, absolutely, sexual pleasure is absolutely a human right in my view. And
absolutely.
And it's something that we need to be aware of, that it's got like relatively low harms, especially compared to other things that are easier to get. And it enhances pleasure and connective feelings between people. So we do have to, I think, be very suspicious of any time anyone's trying to clamp down on that.
And Adam, what about the law and poppers? They're in a bit of a grey area. I mean, the law has not shied away from making drugs illegal that have very little harm in the past. So what's the law?
Yeah. I mean, the law in the UK and the US is kind of similar, which is, it's a sort of version of don't ask, don't tell in a way. It's basically, I mean, there are specific substances that are banned in different countries. So amyl nitrite is banned in the UK. So if you're selling poppers in the UK, or if you're buying poppers in the UK rather, you're going to be buying something that could be pentyl nitrite or propyl nitrite. Whereas in the US, I think butyl nitrite was banned, which was another one of the substances. So these are all different substances. What happens when one substance gets banned is makers try to like synthesize a new substance, which basically has the same effect, but is not named in the law. So you've got a patchwork in different countries, and it's the same in some European countries where there are different substances that you can get. You can go over to Paris and get amyl nitrite. You can buy that in the sex shop, but you can't get that here. In Spain, legally, you can't get any of them, but you can get hold of them, or you just buy them online from an Austrian website and then get them posted, into Spain, like you can do here. But the law is, essentially with slightly different variations. The laws in most of these countries basically say that you can't sell this for human consumption, and you can't direct a person how to use it for that purpose. That's why they put room odorizer on, and they don't say, which would be good harm reduction, they don't say you lift the bottle to your nose and you just sniff the vapor. They don't say that. So it's easy to get confused and drink the thing and then die or nearly die. So there's this weird kind of law thing, but then the companies that make them, they don't really want to have the attention. They're doing well. It's a very cheap product to make, really, and you can charge between £5 and £25 for a bottle, even more if you call it premium, and you don't even say what's in it. So there's a weird kind of cone of silence of the state knows that they're not a big social problem. It's not like opioids or something like that, or heroin, that causes like really quite big social problems as well as physical problems to the person. So the state's kind of like, yeah, we'll look the other way, and the manufacturers are like, and we'll just call it something else, and then everyone's fine. So we're in this weird, and I was drawn to this when I was writing the book. This is going back to what I was saying about the personal thing and the internal reflections on my identity and queer identity, actually, and queer culture. Because when I learned about the laws, I was like, do you know what? That's just like being queer. It's like everyone knows that you're there. Sometimes people turn the other way because they don't want to look. And sometimes you try to evade other people and try to evade society having anything to do with you because you're like, well, it's my body and my sex life, thank you very much. So there's this weird queerness about the way that poppers are labelled and sold, I think, that's really interesting.
And that really comes across in the book as well, and about the whole policing of pleasure and the policing of freedom, and I guess kind of where we're sadly in the world at the moment, where queer rights are being debated more than ever.
Yeah, and I think that what's one thing that's really interesting again about poppers is I talk a lot in the book about potential, so we've talked about pleasure being very important, and I think that another principle for me, which is like my politics and my interest, I guess, is not only the pleasure, but us all recognizing about how much potential we have as individuals, both in our bodies and in our minds. And so, there's openness as a principle, being interested in other things and other cultures and stuff, which is a kind of potential that we have. Like, you never know, you might become interested in something, you might move to Istanbul, whatever. But also in our bodies, we have so much potential because, I went until I was 29 without having sex. And once I started having sex and enjoyed that so much, and it helped me to learn so much about myself and to learn about other people, and it helped me to be like intimate with other people and form like really great friendships, emotional intimacy as well. And I realized, wow, that potential had been in me all that time until I was 29, but it took until I was 29 before I did it. I'm not saying that that's late or whatever, like it's the time that it happened for me, but there's so much potential in all of us. And also just like, yes, I'm a man and I'm a male and a man and my gender is man, whatever. But like, what does that even mean? Like I have like my gender is also often quite more fluid than that, and like the way that I present myself in different situations has more fluidity to it. And I'm not a trans person, but then like trans people are, within the queer family, like really show how much potential is within us. And I think that that's what I was drawn to in thinking about poppers and and have their place in queer culture. That's not just about bum sex between men, which is very lovely and very important, but that there's something else going on, which is that they really show us how much potential we have. Because when you sniff poppers, you just feel like, wow, so connected and so much full of potential in a sexual way and in your spirit, really. So that's something that was just very important for me to explain. And I think that links, Hannah, to what you're saying about politics, because I think what's happening in politics is people are really trying to like lock down definitions of whether it's people or places or rights and stuff. And I think like we just need to acknowledge the potentiality and the openness that people have a lot more.
Definitely. And you hear some of these words shared around with psychedelics as well, in terms of openness and potential.
Acceptance.
And acceptance.
Yeah. That's actually so true, and that effect is much longer lasting than poppers. I should have said at the beginning that like a poppers hit is going to last you a minute or two, but those, you can have longer effects if you take psychedelics and some amphetamines as well, about things to do with like openness and connection and
No, I think when you frame it like that as well, and people, potential, I really like that. I'm going to be telling lots of people, framing it in that way. So I know we're coming towards the end, and you do kind of, you end the book in such a forward-looking statement. And so I was thinking maybe coming towards the end of the podcast, if you kind of had to share one message, it can be a longer message if it needs to be, of what you want people to take away from the book, or from now that it's 4 or 5 years since you finished
we are
writing
nearly
it?
on the fourth anniversary of its publication.
Fourth anniversary.
We are speaking. We're speaking 3 days away from what will be the fourth anniversary of the publication of Deep Sniff. Yes. So great question. I would just say my message about the future is, less so much about poppers. I think we've covered quite well, like that poppers are in a kind of weird legal position and kind of anything could happen. So I would broaden out to just say, like, this started as a gay history book, and it is, in a way, it is a gay history book, but it's actually kind of becomes so much more because my interests are broader than that, and I think that it's interesting to make connections between history and politics and now and everything like that. So I guess the message is just like using it's really useful and powerful to use history as a jumping off point for thinking about culture now and politics now, and that now is obviously, for us, it's now, but it could be whenever. I think I'm just saying, like, history as a practice, not as in like, let's learn some facts about the previous time, but it's a practice of like engaging with stories and where people have come from and what they've done and what that can help us reflect on where we are now and where we might want to go and what world we want to build. It's, history to me is a practice about trying to build the future. So I think that I would say that, which is like quite a stretch away from just talking about a smelly vapor that opens your bum hole for sex, but that's where we are.
No, I think that's great. I think even as a scientist, I've always found that I find it important to understand the history of the science and the context. And I mean, that's why it's a massive privilege doing the podcast with Joe. Like, we've had amazing guests who just help us understand the societal context, the historical context of so many different drugs, and also like beyond that as well. And yeah, I really took that from the book. It was, it's great. I really encourage people. So you've got an audio book of it. There's the book people can buy online.
Yeah, I sat in a booth for 2 days with some Red Bull and Snickers bars and read the whole
2
book.
days?
So
that's such a short time. Wow.
I know. Well, we didn't have any money for it, so I said I'm going to do it all in 2 days. I'm going to pack it all into 2 days. Yeah. So it's an audio book. You can get it in the US, you can get it in the UK, and anywhere else online and get it sent to you. It's also actually published in Spanish. If there's any Spanish speakers, it's called Inhalación Profunda: Historia del Popper y Futuras Queer. I didn't translate it. It has its own translator, but it's published in Spanish by Dos Bigotes. It's an editorial in Madrid. And it's Deep Sniff. So
Hannah is learning Spanish, so maybe.
Oh no!
Okay, so you can, now you have to read it in Spanish, Hannah.
Yes, I think we should read it in Spanish.
It's definitely not one of my strengths, put it that way. Languages, not my forte.
No.
We will make sure we put all the links in the show notes. And if there's anything else for us to include, then please let us know. And we can add that as well. But a massive thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
It's been a big pleasure.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, good, big pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Brilliant, Adam. Thank you so much.
Okay, lovely to speak to you.